The desert stretched endlessly, shimmering under a sun that burned without mercy. Wind rolled over the dunes, stirring ghosts of dust and forgotten stories. Out there, among the emptiness, rode Ethan Cole, lean, quiet, and sun-worn, his hat pulled low and his eyes half closed against the glare. His horse, a steady roan named Jasper, moved at an unhurried pace, hooves sinking deep into the dry sand. Ethan had been riding for 3 days, and in all that time, not a single soul had crossed his path. He wasn't running, but he wasn't staying anywhere either. He was one of those men who belonged nowhere, drifting from ranch to ranch, taking work when it came, sleeping under the stars when it didn't. The war had left him with scars no doctor could find, silent kind, the kind that made him stare too long at the horizon as if trying to remember what he'd lost there. A woman once waited for him back in Abilene, but that was years ago. Her last letter never reached him. Or maybe it did, and he just never opened it. When he reached the White River settlement, it was nearly dusk. The land there was brittle and red, cut through by a silver stream that snaked its way to the east. The town nearby was small, a few wooden houses, a saloon with a broken window, and a church whose bell hadn't rung in months. Most of the folks who stayed did it because they had nowhere else to go. Ethan fit right in. The Holbrook Ranch lay about a mile out of town, surrounded by split rail fences and a handful of cattle grazing lazily under the evening light. The old man, Mr. Holbrook, met him at the gate, stooped, with white hair and eyes that still held a spark. "You can fix a fence?" he asked without much ceremony. Ethan nodded. "Better than I can fix people." Holbrook gave a grunt that sounded like a laugh. "Good enough. You can bunk in the barn. Start at first light." It was only when Ethan led his horse to the stable that he noticed someone watching from the other side of the corral, a girl, standing still as a stone. Her long dark hair was braided loosely, and her skin caught the last bit of sunset in its glow. She wore a worn shawl around her shoulders, and her feet were bare, toes sinking into the dusty earth. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the silence between them stretching thin like thread. Ethan tipped his hat. "Evenin'." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened a little. "Evening," she said, her voice low and careful, like she wasn't used to saying much. He could tell right away she was Apache. The Holbrooks had taken in a few orphaned girls from the nearby reservation after a raid years ago. Some stayed to help around the ranch. Some left. He didn't know which she was yet. "Name's Ethan," he said, untying his saddlebag. "You work here too?" "Yes," she replied. "I take care of the horses. And the chickens. Sometimes the old woman." He smiled faintly. "Sounds like you do just about everything." She tilted her head slightly, as if deciding whether that was meant to be teasing. "I do what I can." There was something about her, something strong beneath the quiet, like a storm behind still clouds. He didn't ask her name, and she didn't offer it. They just went their ways, strangers under the same fading sun. That night, Ethan lay in the loft of the barn, listening to the crickets and the restless sighs of the horses below. He thought of the girl's eyes, deep amber, the kind that saw too much and said too little. Somewhere out there, the wind moaned across the desert, carrying stories he didn't yet know. Morning came early. The air was cool before the sun climbed high. Ethan got to work fixing the southern fence line, his shirt clinging with sweat by mid-morning. He was hammering a new post when he noticed her again, leading a chestnut colt from the stable. The animal was young and stubborn, jerking against the rope, tossing its head. She held firm, patient, whispering to it in her language. There was something graceful about the way she moved, steady, calm, unafraid. But not everyone on the ranch treated her with respect. Wade and Murphy, two other hands, leaned against the fence nearby, watching her like hyenas. "Look at her," Wade muttered. "Acts like she owns the place." Murphy spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Can't trust those kind. Always thinkin' they're better'n us." Ethan felt the tension rise in his chest. He'd seen this kind of talk before, and it never ended right. The colt jerked again, nearly pulling the rope from her hand, and Wade laughed. "Careful, sweetheart, you'll scare the poor thing." The girl said nothing, jaw tight, eyes straight ahead. Ethan dropped his hammer. "That's enough." Wade turned, his smirk fading. "You talkin' to me, cowboy?" "Reckon I am." Murphy shifted uneasily, sensing trouble. But Wade stepped forward, squaring up. "You got something to say about the help?" Ethan's voice was calm, but his eyes were cold. "I got something to say about cowards." The silence that followed was sharp as a blade. Then Wade spat in the dirt, muttered something under his breath, and walked off, Murphy trailing behind. Ethan picked up his hammer again, the matter closed. When he turned back, the girl was staring at him, eyes wide, surprised. "No one ever stops them," she said quietly. "Well," Ethan replied, forcing a small smile, "guess I ain't no one." That evening, she brought him coffee while he sat by the fire. She didn't say much, just set the tin cup beside him and stood watching the flames. "Thank you," he said, taking a sip. The brew was strong, bitter, but it warmed his chest. "I didn't ask your name," he said after a while. "Taya," she replied. "It means perfectly formed." He nodded slowly. "Taya," he repeated, letting the name roll through the quiet night. "That's a fine name." She sat down on the other side of the fire, knees drawn to her chest. The stars came out one by one, scattered across the dark sky like spilled salt. For a long time, neither spoke. Then, softly, she began to talk, about her family, her village, the soldiers who came one morning when she was a child. How she hid under a wagon, clutching her little brother's hand until his fingers went still. Ethan didn't move, he just listened. When she finished, the only sound was the crackle of wood and the low hum of crickets. He told her his story too, about the war, about the woman he'd left behind, about how he'd learned that some things couldn't be fixed, no matter how hard you tried. The fire burned low, throwing shadows across their faces. She looked at him then, eyes shimmering like wet amber. "You don't look like a man who's lost," she said. He chuckled softly. "That's 'cause I been lost so long, I started callin' it livin'." She smiled for the first time, small and shy, like a flower opening in dry soil. When dawn came, Ethan found himself still sitting by the ashes of the fire, his hat tipped low, and the first light of day brushing over her face as she slept nearby, wrapped in her shawl. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like drifting. The desert, cruel and beautiful, had given him something he hadn't known he was missing. A reason to stay. The heat came early that summer, pressing down on the ranch like a heavy hand. Days bled together in the slow rhythm of chores and sweat. Ethan mended fences, drove cattle, fixed saddles, and tried not to look at Taya too long when she walked past with her braids swinging softly against her back. He told himself she was just a girl, too young, too pure for a man like him, but every time she smiled, even a little, something inside him stirred that he thought had long turned to dust. She'd started humming while she worked, soft songs from her people that floated through the dry air like prayers. Ethan would hear them from across the field, and though he never asked what the words meant, he understood all the same. The songs were about loss and rebirth, about staying when the world told you to run. Sometimes, they talked in the quiet hours after work. He'd sit on the porch sharpening his knife while she braided a rope or mended her shawl. She liked asking him questions about the world beyond the desert, the sea, the trains, the cities she'd only heard about. "Do they really have lamps that burn all night?" she once asked, eyes wide as the stars. "They do," he said with a grin. "But I'll take moonlight over them any day." One night, when the sky was dark and still, thunder rolled from far away. Ethan looked up from his work and saw lightning flicker on the horizon. "Storm's coming," he murmured. By morning, the clouds had gathered thick and gray, hiding the sun completely. The smell of rain was in the air, heavy and alive. Holbrook sent Ethan and Taya to check the lower field by the river before it flooded. They rode together in silence, the horses' hooves muffled by the damp earth. When they reached the riverbank, the water was already rising, brown and foaming, pulling at the edges like it meant to swallow everything. "We should head back," Ethan said. Taya nodded, but just as they turned, her horse reared at a crack of thunder. The reins slipped from her hand, and before Ethan could reach her, the animal bolted straight toward the old wooden bridge. "Taya," he shouted, spurring Jasper forward. The bridge creaked and shuddered under the weight. Halfway across, one of the planks snapped, and Taya's horse stumbled. She fell, tumbling down into the churning river below. Ethan didn't think. He didn't weigh the danger or the current. He just threw himself from the saddle and hit the water hard, the cold shocking the air from his lungs. The river was wild, roaring, pulling him under again and again. He fought his way to the surface, scanning frantically until he saw her, clinging to a half-broken branch, her shawl tangled around her arm. He swam hard, the current dragging at his boots, his hat lost somewhere downstream. "Taya," he yelled. She lifted her head weakly, eyes wide with fear. Another wave slammed into them, and Ethan barely managed to grab her wrist. She was freezing, shaking so badly he thought she might let go. He hooked an arm around her waist and kicked toward the bank, every muscle screaming. Finally, after what felt like forever, he pulled her onto the muddy shore. She collapsed against him, coughing and gasping. Rain started to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the earth. Ethan stripped off his jacket and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. Her lips were blue, her hair plastered to her face, eyes glistening like wet amber. "Reckless fool," he muttered, brushing her hair aside. "You could have been killed. You came back," she whispered. He frowned, not understanding. "You could have let me go," she said, voice shaking. "Most people would have." He didn't answer. His breath was rough in his chest. He looked at her, at the rain dripping from her lashes, at the way she shivered but didn't pull away. Then she said something that stopped time itself. "Ethan," she murmured, her voice small and trembling, "no one ever kissed me." The words hit him like lightning. For a heartbeat, he couldn't breathe. Her eyes searched his, full of innocence and sorrow and something else, something she didn't yet understand. The storm raged around them, thunder rolling over the hills, wind tearing at the trees. Slowly, Ethan reached out, his hand brushing her cheek. Her skin was cold but soft beneath his rough fingers. He hesitated, every part of him torn between right and wrong, between duty and desire. Then, with a breath that felt like surrender, he bent down and kissed her. It wasn't a long kiss. It wasn't desperate or wild. It was gentle, warm, steady, full of everything he'd never said. Her lips trembled under his, unsure at first, then certain. When he pulled away, she was crying silently, rain and tears mixing on her face. "Now you have," he whispered. After that day, nothing was the same. They went back to the ranch, said little about what had happened, but the air between them had changed. She would smile when he passed, and he would find excuses to linger near her while fixing a saddle or fetching water. At night, she'd hum her songs again, softer this time, and he'd find peace just listening. But peace never lasts long in a place where people judge more than they understand. One afternoon, a government wagon came up the dirt road, carrying 2 officers in gray coats. The kind who didn't smile. Holbrook met them at the porch while Ethan stood nearby, arms crossed. "We've got orders," one of the officers said. "Any native still living outside the reservation is to be relocated. Names, numbers, all of them." Holbrook stiffened. "This girl's been with us for years. She's part of this ranch." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Doesn't matter. She's one of them." He pointed toward the barn, where Taya stood in the doorway, frozen. Ethan's pulse quickened. "She ain't going anywhere." The officer turned, sneering. "You got a problem, cowboy?" "Yeah," Ethan said, stepping forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Big one." The officer rested his hand on his pistol. The sound of leather creaked, sharp in the silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Ethan shifted his coat aside, revealing the rifle slung across his chest. "You can tell your captain," he said, "that this ranch don't answer to fools with papers and no heart." The man's jaw tightened. He looked at Ethan, then at the steady barrel of the rifle, and finally spat in the dust. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Ethan replied, "but not tonight." When the wagon finally turned and rolled away, Taya's legs gave out. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, trembling. Ethan knelt beside her, his hands on her shoulders. "You'll get yourself killed for me," she whispered, voice breaking. He smiled, small and tired. "Ain't the first time I risked my life. But it's the first time it ever meant something." That night, she came to his cabin. They sat side by side, listening to the crickets. She rested her head against his shoulder. "The world will never let us be," she said softly. He wrapped his arm around her. "Then we'll just have to stop asking it to." Years passed, and the ranch changed hands, the land growing quieter with each season. People said the cowboy and the Apache girl had left together, heading west toward the mountains. Others said they stayed, living by the river in a small house made of logs and love. But sometimes, when the wind swept across the canyon and the moonlight touched the old wooden bridge, people swore they could still hear them, her laughter like music on the wind, and his voice low and steady, calling her name. Maybe the desert doesn't forget after all. Maybe it just keeps their story, buried in the sand and carried by the wind, a reminder that love, once found, never truly fades.